Okay, welcome everyone to today's gender studies seminar. Today we have an esteemed guest joining us, Tara Blagg, and we'll let her introduce herself later. Before we begin, let's do a quick introduction of who we are. We're United Proud Women. We operate to empower sexual minority women, and we do that through studying together, community building events, networking, and also doing collective advocacy or collective action. And here are our YouTube channel. And recently we just finished our annual conference with more than 40 attendees. It was a big event, so please check it out if you have time. And we have both English and Chinese subtitles for people who do not understand certain languages. And we have our Discord channel and our usual WeChat regional contact if people want to join our vibrant online community. We also have our website hosting all of the event information and some other social platforms, and feel free to reach out. Some recent events. So our stand-up comedian show, it is going to be on the 30th of September, and we're going to have around 20 performers joining us, and it's a Chinese speaking event, but feel free to show up anyway just to support the community. And also we have Professor Shu Zhenhuang joining us next week, and this is a quick advertisement of her latest research regarding Chinese women and sexual minority and queer identities. And feel free to email them. You can not only get a $30 gift card, but you can also get in touch with some of the prominent scholar in this field, and as well as they're really nice people. So just it has been quite an enjoyable experience just talking to them. Okay, our next week is going to be Professor Shu Zhenhuang's session on the title is called On Our Own Terms, Queer Chinese Woman Imaginary, and we're going to talk about Chinese and queer and women identities and the challenges faced by the community, and why it is an important identity that we can potentially focus on, and the concepts of the queer identities and Chinese as an intersectionality. And she is also going to present some of her latest publications. And then we will have our upcoming weeks. This is a fall semester of 2023. And we're going to cover the topic of embodiment and gender and sexuality. We're going to have our usual 5 sessions and covering really deep topics in the subject of embodiment. And we're also going to welcome the famous scholar that everyone probably should already be pretty familiar with, because we studied 2 of her books in our seminar semester 2, and that's Professor Tani Barlow. And this is happening in mid-October, so please come and support this event, and also have a direct dialogue with Professor Barlow. Without further ado, let's welcome Tara Blagg joining us. Tara, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, those upcoming events all sound awesome. And yeah, I'm honored to again be invited to speak here. A little bit about myself. I'm right now a Ph.D. candidate at RAND, getting a Ph.D. in public policy. I got my master's in political social work in Houston. I'm really interested in communities and sort of how communities are made up, families, children, and how to promote social equity within communities. So before this, I've worked at in the LA city for a city council person, and also for the city controller. Before that, I was a staffer at the Texas House of Representatives. I was the director of one of the House committees. And before that, I was at a different think tank. So the workshop that I'm going to be giving today, actually, I had put it together several years ago when I was working on a project that was in a gentrifying neighborhood in Houston. And we were doing like a community partnered research project to get together like a group of people who were involved in their communities and sort of concerned about like how their communities were changing and wanting to make sure that they were gaining the benefits of all of the investments that were coming in. So the advocacy training was initially for them, and that sort of got the ball rolling for a lot more like community organizing and a lot of really cool things down the line. So this was just a piece of that. And I'll also be giving this training to another group of community members here who are going to be advocating for improvements in their parks in LA. And yeah, I've given this training also to a few groups that were advocating around the Texas House of Representatives and like wanting to know how best to do that. So it's been a while since I've done this, but hopefully y'all find it at least somewhat helpful. And I guess I can just jump right into it if that works.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Let me share my. So this is a workshop, so it's like super interactive. I want it to be relevant to you guys, so I'll be asking, you know, what are some issues that you want to potentially advocate on or like think about advocating on, and we'll sort of just like go through everything step by step and like how you would do that. So at the end of this, you'll have like a plan for advocating. What are you seeing on the screen?
We're seeing slide number 2.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to start out with sort of like what is advocacy? What do you guys think advocacy means to you? Because it I'm sure a lot of people here have experience in advocating, maybe not in like maybe like a professional capacity or even just like in your personal life. So what does advocacy mean to you? I guess, I mean, there's not too many people here, so we could go one by one. I don't know, Yushin, do you think that's gonna take too long?
Yeah,
Or
I think we can, or people can volunteer first.
yeah.
I'm gonna cold call on people.
Oh.
We can start with our women staff. Okay. For me, I think advocacy. When I think about advocacy, it's more about like promoting certain ideas or like ideology, or especially regarding queer world making, given that the current situation is leaning so much toward like capitalism or all of the power structures and heteronormativity. So advocacy is a way of showing people the alternatives, or at least
Yeah.
that's for me, like saying something that advocating for something that matters for our community that is different, probably different from the current status quo. I'm gonna pass it down to Liu Chao.
Right. So yeah. So actually, I'm not clear about like what our workshop today is like is specifically about, right, on advocacy. So I actually are like expecting some more like clarification from you guys. I also got late, maybe. I'm sorry about that.
Oh no, it's okay. Yeah, I think advocacy can mean a lot of different things to different people, but I think generally it's about sort of like leading a change in something you want to see, like identifying a change you want to see, and then sort of making that happen. And the training today is sort of about how to make that happen through like government structures and policy and laws and things like that. But it could be done on any sort of level. Like you could advocate in your workplace, or you could advocate in your family or in your friend group, you know, just anything you want to see change, and then making it happen and seeing it play out. I think that's generally what it is, but I think it's different for everybody. Like
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So are we like specifically like talking about this advocacy in the United States? Okay.
Yeah, that's the only context that I have experience in, but if anybody here wants to like jump in and add their experience with anywhere else, like that would be awesome, because yeah, I'm very just limited to the US context, unfortunately. So
let's hear from Marisol. They are very active in the local LA community and obviously part of a lot of different communities. So Marisol, what are your thoughts about advocacy?
So conveniently enough, what you mentioned about kind of like what you want to see happen, getting that to work. I happened to accidentally start my friend on a huge rant. So I got her to convert that rant into like, what would the reasonable next step be? And it was I dropped that in the chat. But that's kind of looking at like that's looking at more of a very specific policy change perspective, which I guess is kind of the point. Yeah, I don't know. I think that also it's sometimes what helps too is to know that it's okay if you're not the person that wants to be talking to everyone. Like, it's okay if you're not super extroverted and you don't want to be the person who's persuasive. There's still things that you can do, either on like a mutual aid level, from just like starting from observation, seeing what's necessary in the community around you, either like literal physical space around your home, or like a community as you engage with socially in your area or beyond. And then there's lots of ways to sort of connect people and the things that you want to see happen with the people that can make it happen.
Thanks. Yeah, that's awesome. I'll be going into all of those things later.
Okay, I think that maybe we have different contextual strategies for doing the rights advocacy, especially under the region censorship, especially like in mainland China. I know if you are in America, you are in the US, you can take many confrontational and public forms and even the politically radical forms to conduct the rights advocacy for the LGBT people, for the women's rights. But in China, you know, because of the censorship, the restriction against the public activism, you may take the form like the cultural activism, like the cultural the art performances, and like maybe the form of the academic activism, like what we are doing. You know, you'd have the webinars and you share the knowledges that are different from what they called the the heteronormative knowledge. So I think even the knowledge projection and promotion in everyday life can count as a kind of right advocacy in some context. So I mean, there are very many different and diverse forms of the rights advocacy. Depends on different context.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really good point. And yeah, I like that you bring up things like cultural activism, knowledge production as strategies for advocacy that people don't usually think of when they think of like direct advocacy. Yeah, if no one else has anything to add, we can jump right into starting to think about some issues that we could talk about as examples to sort of take us through our advocacy plan. So my next question is, what are some communities you're a part of? And we had a session, actually, I think a few sessions ago that Tori led. We were talking about like communities and coalitions and yeah, so what are some communities that people feel they're a part of? And from there, we'll be able to zero in on some issues that are facing your communities.
I think one of the prominent ones are homophobia or heteronormativity, or recently, since I'm doing our next seminar's reading, there is a notion called symbolic violence, where although something is not explicitly mentioned, it becomes like a tacit in a society or the community, where people do not even have the right terminology or the right symbols to represent themselves. So I think that's especially the case for our queer community, because as I think we previously defined, queerness is always almost on the horizon. That means a lot of the things do not even exist in the society, not to mention that to promote for those concepts or ideologies.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we're kind of starting from scratch without having to build our own sort of terms and definitions.
And also internal conflicts. That's a huge one. Like just because of these lack of, I guess, symbols to represent ourselves. So sometimes even people share sexual minority identities sometimes get into almost like fights or arguments on which term can be used under which context by which identity, and it becomes like a game that never make any or seldom make any progress, but can easily turn into like type of a fight.
So what are some of these like sub-communities?
To give you a concrete example, I think Yujie 老师 is also like pretty has a pretty deep understanding of this situation. Like the term called TERF, meaning the people who are transphobia, and then that can sometimes even involve the feminist community, because they think that the trans identity can be a role play of like to enhance gender stereotypes. So the feminist community can sometimes feel offended when certain gender roles are purposely performed by some trans-identified people. I myself is non-binary and maybe even trans-identified, so I can deeply relate to, like, I guess from the both side, because they both face very similar struggle of like finding it hard to find the terms or like I don't know, literature to represent themselves. So yeah, like just these kind of symbolic level negotiation is pretty tough. No TERFs. Yeah, I see from the chat, no TERFs. United Proud Women is very trans friendly, and I mean a lot of our staff member are actually members of the trans community, and this is such an important part of our community.
Does anyone else have any communities that they identify with that we haven't listed here? I know you brought up like several issues and I haven't been writing them down, but that's actually my next question. So following from these communities, what are some specific issues that you're concerned about? I know Yushin, you mentioned like TERFs.
And Yujie 老师, do you want to jump in and talk about like the work in China, and especially given your identity as one of the biggest influencers on social media in China, and also your identity of your academic research? So probably you can have a more thorough understanding from all different perspectives.
I mean, I'm not that influential, I think so. That I think that in China, because the knowledge, I mean the mainstream knowledge is a kind of a heteronormative thing, and even the feminists they grow up in China, they have no access to the trans feminism. They have been their ideas have been shaped by those cis heteronormative knowledge, and they think that transgender is like especially like the man who conquered women's space. So actually, I mean, there is many conflicts between the what they call the mainstream feminist society and the queer communities in China, especially even though they try to fight for the gender equality, but in China, the people still hold the radical view and especially the essentialist view on gender. They think there are only two genders, one is the male and one is the female, and you cannot cross the line between this boundary opposition. So actually it means that even some people, especially the feminists, they hold the will towards the gender equality. They would not admit the will of gender diversity. So it's like you must to negotiate these dynamics between the two different communities, because in China they don't have the access to those the queer knowledge, the queer theory, but they only have the knowledge. They're not I mean their ideas almost shaped by those essentialist will. So it's very difficult in China to do the queer feminism.
Yeah, it seems like it's in China we have a very different set of problem, and especially given like it's still a very binary society. And since we have Albus online, Albus, I don't know if you want to share anything about your identity and your thoughts about advocacy, given your trans identity, if you're still around, or feel free to share later.
Yeah, I'm driving, so the microphone might not be ideal, but
yeah, we can
for
hear
me,
you
like
pretty well.
advocacy has a lot to do with social justice. I feel like a lot of time for me, at least personally, like the things I advocate for are a lot of times injustice we have like in this set of people. I personally did had like advocacy work both in the US and also in China, but not as much in China. But definitely like with in China, like at least right now or for the past 2 years, the censorship and the government control has been more severe than before. So a lot of and I'm aware that a lot of like gender related and LGBTQ nonprofit organizations, non-government organizations in China has been forced to like close down. So that's definitely a big part of the advocacy work in China. Is how the systematic oppression is really present right now, and that can be very hard for whoever's doing advocacy work in China. It's very hard to combat. In the US, I do feel like there are a little bit less censorship, but the institutional and systematic oppression is still very relevant. And a lot of time in the US, I'm aware that it's a lot of grassroots organizing and like lawmaking and like policy changing, which are more, I feel like, are more relevant to the US context.
Yeah, I hear a lot of institutionalized oppression or systematic type of oppression and censorship. That's like a thing that is very prominent in China. In the US, I think we're dealing with like moving different parties towards the same goal or changing the policies and no sex education in chat mentioned by Yujue. Many feminists hold a hostile attitude toward sex workers, reproducing slut shame and dehumanization of them. Wow, so many valid points. So many issues we're facing, Tara.
I know. Yeah, these are all really good points. And for those of you who have experience in advocacy, please jump in. I'd love to hear your experience and your thoughts. This is all super interesting already. Just hearing everyone's experience. So we have some issues pointed out that are facing these communities that we're a part of. So the next step is sort of defining it in more concrete ways to come up with a strategy to combat them. So let me pull up these issues again. So for example, what are some ways that trans exclusion or TERFs, what are some ways that that issue is present in policy or just like in everyday life? Like how does that present itself in life that you come across? Or it could be any of these other things too.
It's very hard. Tara, do you want to share some of your thoughts?
So I guess the first thing to come to mind is when I was in Texas, there was this really horrible bill being passed, and it was about it was called the bathroom bill, and it basically said that anybody being caught using the wrong bathroom, like, you know, male bathroom or female bathroom, could be arrested and fined. So essentially this was, you know, it was geared at attacking trans communities. It was very transparent. And it had a lot of backing. And I think something like that is where I see, you know, something like this first issue being present in people's lives, or even like a lack of like a gender neutral bathrooms in like a workplace. It could be something as immediate as that as well, or something in policy that, you know, can lead to just a lot of really bad outcomes.
That makes sense. Regarding trans community, I think another one is like the military exclusion of trans identified people, and also like the bathroom bill, as you mentioned, and also the medical, the healthcare system not covering the gender reaffirmative surgeries. And regarding the queer world making type of issue, some of the most prominent ones I can think of are like the assimilation of the into the heteronormative ways of living, such as marriage systems, or like still the sense of having children equals to like having a future together, or like has to be monogamous, has to follow the nucleus family structure, that type of issue. Yeah, like the whole marriage system is kind of heteronormative. How do we, can we define the marriage system to be the issue? Maybe that's too progressive. One step at a time.
No, these are all good points. And I think with this, when you're trying to come up with a strategy, it helps to be like as specific as possible. So I really liked your example about healthcare not covering gender affirming surgeries. And then, you know, like I said, like the lack of gender neutral bathrooms, like in a workplace. That's something that you can just notice in your everyday surroundings that you could potentially advocate for.
How about the two people structure of the marriage system, or like the only social possible doing social way to do social collaborations through like marriage system instead of like community systems? Or
yeah, so like I guess what you say, like a legal system based around like heteronormative.
Yeah, like all of the immigration stuff regarding like marriage and and taxed and taxes, and also what else? So many regarding marriage system.
Right. Yeah.
Healthcare also. And
no, definitely.
Anyone else? I feel like I'm talking too much.
I see some things in the chat. I haven't been.
I don't know, as an example. Well, I guess I'm to also like some broader issues, since you're mentioning the gender neutral bathroom. I think it's important like to always bring up like disability access, right? I think like disability tends to be a really important nexus for us to see how many issues we still have and how frequently we're willing to like write off people that we don't want to care about or want to take care of. And that's kind of one of those things where it's not only are there not really gender neutral bathrooms, but there's frequently like not enough or not accessible accessible bathrooms. Like I've been to venues where they'll have like one accessible bathroom and it's locked, right? Or it's broken or things like that. And or though it's like it's gender neutral, but it's also like accessible, but it's also for the family. So there's that. And then also thinking about other local things, just the sort of stuff that kind of goes together, right? Like I think that there's a lot of connection between like the consistent defunding of education that we've been doing in the US since the 80s, as well as like increasing privatization. And we're starting to see that, I don't know if come to a head is the right term, but we're seeing that be a lot more kind of prominent and blatant these days. So I think the Houston school takeover is a good example, where Houston is actually really blue, but they've had sort of like a red takeover of the schools that has resulted in a lot of issues. And so part of that is like people in the right side are really pushing for like, oh, well, we should have choice. And so they're basically trying to get a public defunding of education and a private, and like allowing schools just primarily to be private, which then becomes like a very profitable. So it's kind of like a grift. So there's a lot of local places, I think, to look at for either like stopping things that are happening that will have long and short-term negative consequences, and also reversing things, or just actually just making change to stuff that's already long established, like the way that taxes are like directly tied to the allocation of funding, and that kind of means that people that have money will have more money in their resources, and people that don't have money won't have money in resources. A lot of things, but I think those things also kind of become the building blocks for like how willing people are to have like I don't know, more changes in systems when it comes to whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like there's a lot of really good examples here of like bigger structural issues, like, you know, basing funding off of taxes, and, you know, a legal system, an entire legal system based around heteronormative marriage that, you know, affects immigration, affects taxes and healthcare. And then there's, you know, lack of gender neutral bathrooms. So there's a good mix here. I see June said something else in the chat. June, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
I mean, still something that reminds me of the pathologization of transgender. You know, in 1990, I think it's during the 1990s when when Chinese people firstly know something about the transgender people in their real life. At that time, you know, there I think it's since the 1984 when the Chinese government they introduced the crime of hooliganism 流氓罪 in China. You know, the people who conduct same-sex intimacy, who are you know, cross-dressing, they are also punished under that crime. And I think it's the late 1990s when Chinese people they introduced the pathologization of transgender, which they called the gender identity disorder in China. They helped to decriminalization of trans people. I mean, they try to confirm that those people they are the patients with the kind of a mental disorder, but they're not the criminals. At that time, you know, the pathologization helped to save those trans people from the criminalization and the punishment. But and after I think it's 1997, the abolishment of the crime of the hooliganism, you know, the pathologization of transgender, which they are still considered as a kind of a mental disorder, a kind of a disease, rationalized the discriminalization against the trans people, and even rationalize the conversion therapy, because they think it's a kind of a disorder, it's a kind of a mental disorder, you need to cure it, so you need to take the conversion therapy instead of the affirmative therapy in China. So I think there is a dual effects of this of the pathologization agenda.
That's so true. I also wanted to bring up not only the pathologization of trans-identified people, but also the overall DSM-5 categorizations of mental disorders. And instead of like just calling some behavior madness or something like fun or creating alternatives, like we classify them into disorders or like disease to stop people from creating these alternatives for our queer world.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I see Patara Cho also mentioning something about gender neutral bathroom. Do you want to share?
No, I'm just talking about there's actually like, because I'm like in architecture and public law, that actually all of the space they have regulations about dimensions and then how people are going to use it. But right now for gender neutral bathrooms, there's no regulation. There's no regulation about that. So that's another perspective that's the reason that lack of those facilities in public space, I think.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example of like taking an issue here that we've identified and then kind of tying it to something that can be advocated for. So something concrete, like having these regulations. So yeah, we'll definitely keep that in mind as we go down. But I also, when we're doing these assessment exercises and defining the issues, I think it's also important to think about the strengths. So going back to our communities, we see, you know, all of these issues facing these communities that we're part of, but what are the strengths of our communities? I feel like that's also really good to have an inventory of, because it'll help you when you're coming up with strategies down the line to draw from those unique strengths. So what would you all say, looking at these communities or maybe some other communities that you're a part of? What are some of the strengths that come to mind.
Do you mind giving an example first?
So I guess for the queer community, I feel like there's a closeness and there's like a I mean there are a lot of divisions within our community, but I think there is like sort of a trust and a strength in that. And so it could be easier maybe to build a coalition you know around the queer community because of that closeness and looking out for each other. Yeah, and that kind of goes back to like the coalition building and even just framing like LGBT as a coalition helps different subgroups look out for each other and have that like closeness and that camaraderie.
I think and also just on top of the closeness within queer community and also the domain expertise, just looking at the audience, I identify different occupations, different skill sets people have. And in queer world, since people are like out of the tragedy of heteronormativity, people usually spend more time investing in things they really care about, and then they become prominent or they become good at what they do, and leaders of certain industries that can potentially play a role in adding leverage in the negotiation process. And just to mention, like previously when we had our conversation with Professor Tani Barlow, she said that we are the ones that have the capability to change the institution. So yeah, I feel like just the sense of ownership and sense of like the proactiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, based on our differences as well, remembering like also in our past conversation, we're also talking about how like the resilience we built throughout the time as queer identified people, and also the differences or the traumatizing experience really bring people together, so we can navigate through these, or at least use our I don't know, willpower is one of our strengths as well.
Yeah, those are all super good points. Yeah, definitely agree with all of that. Before we move on, does anyone else have a strength that we haven't mentioned yet?
June, do you want to chime in about the Chinese situation, just to provide a different perspective?
Yeah, I think it's actually nice. We're actually asking this question like, what's our strengths, right? Really, I seldom give it a think like we and kind of realize that we do have some strengths in this. So motivation. Well, I think that's probably the sense of ownership. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's really good. And yeah, I think it's hard for people. Usually we focus on the issues and not as much the strengths that we bring to the table, which is a lot. As we can see here, we already listed 5 things, and there's many more. So yeah, we'll keep these things in mind when we're thinking up strategies down the line. Okay, so let's choose one of these things to focus on, so that we can just kind of have a good overview of the rest of this. So what do you think? Does anyone feel strongly about choosing one of these things to go through the rest of the exercise with?
Yujie老师, do you have any thoughts? I would really love to hear about your especially your intersectionality with the Chinese type of advocacy.
I mean, the situation changed a lot in China. I think it's since the 2017, I think. I think because the Chinese government, they try to bounce the what they call the Western forces, like especially the USA and with the LGBT agenda. They try to confirm that the LGBT agenda is not a thing that is really happening in China. It's not a local thing, but it's a kind of agenda that's introduced to Chinese context by what they call the Western hostile forces like America, like what they call it, you know, they try to separate the LGBT people from the what they call the mainstream Chinese citizens. So we face the kind of issue that how to confirm that we are a part of the Chinese citizens. We are not something that's from the West, and we live in China and we belong to this local context. So it's relatively difficult for the LGBT people to survive in recent years. You know, in China, actually, I think after the abolishment of the crime of hooliganism, they actually criminalize the homosexuality and the transgender. However, nowadays, I think especially the Ministry of Education in some provinces, they issued prohibition against the LGBT agenda, which they called a kind of a Western propaganda. So we need to confirm that we are part of the Chinese history, part of the Chinese culture, and even part of the Chinese citizens in this time.
Mm. Seems like there's a lot of focus on the transgender safety, or like maybe we can focus on the bathroom case. What does everyone think?
Yeah, that sounds good. And it sounds like it's something that
It's probably applicable to a lot of different cultures.
yeah, different. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. Well,
Yeah, this can easily turn into a global movement as well.
yeah, definitely. So we've identified an issue here. So the next thing is to start with a long-term goal. So if the issue here is lack of gender neutral bathrooms, I'm not sure why it's not typing, but okay, lack of gender neutral bathrooms is the issue. So what's the long-term goal? And Yushin, you mentioned a global movement. That's awesome. So I think that's a really good long-term goal. So so do you want to talk a little bit more, like what would that global movement look like? What would the end goal of that be?
Yeah, the goal would be like, since bathroom is one of the most visible like sign of gender or sex, the binary sex or gender. I think if we remove this from people's daily life, I think it's going to contribute in the queer world making agenda, because like gender is kind of like a blur concept without the physical separation of space. So the long-term goal would be for, like, I don't know, at least for me, globally, we get rid of the concept of separation of space based on sex or gender. It's kind of ridiculous, like just like segregation. You have to like separate certain race from another. Like, why do we have to separate people just because of their sex genitals? Just difference in bodies.
Definitely. So what can be achieved in the medium and short term to lead up to that? So here we're sort of taking this long-term goal and breaking it into something that is actionable in a shorter range of time. So what could happen in the next year, or what could happen in the next 5 years? So I know June mentioned or someone else, 2 people mentioned now regulations. Katara, I think you were the one who mentioned that there's no regulation for it now. So is that in the US?
I think that's globally there's no regulation for
Yeah.
gender neutral bathroom right now. It's not just for US. US actually require for like a sign that you should have a sign that make people know that this like kind of like neutral gender bathroom, but they're not truly neutral gender bathroom inside. They just have a sign outside, like on the outside.
So if there were to be regulations, what would those look like?
I don't know. I think that's probably related to like architectural laws and then public laws that should have like what kind of percentage in a public space that you should have, like how much gender neutral bathroom and then accessible bathrooms, those regulations like that.
Okay, so we can say like a law passed that mandates like a certain percentage of gender neutral bathrooms in a building, and this could
And
be
accessible. You should make sure that they're accessible.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that there would also be in the nature of like buildings, there'd be two different subsets. There would be the new building plans, and then there would also be the renovation and restoration plans, where you could have something like for a new building, you could require something like the whole thing is like gender neutral restrooms. And I don't know, like you could have gendered powder rooms or something if you wanted. And then for renovations, it would be maybe like one gender neutral restroom, accessible, obviously, for every 3 toilets that are installed and gendered or something like that, as a random number. But
Yeah.
and also I think it's also important to remember that like frequently the places that we're going to start with this are going to be in like your local town, village, or district if it's a district incorporated by a city. And the more that you get that like smaller level like laws passed, and then like the more you can end up with like information about how that goes, and the more you can use that to justify getting those things passed at higher levels.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's a great segue to our next point. So once you have a solid short-term goal, and I like how specific these are, the more specific the better when you're trying to devise a solid strategy. Who would be the target? So Marisol, you mentioned that local government would probably be the best target for this.
I think specifically legislators, right? Like you wouldn't necessarily, like I think you might first think to call your mayor, but who you really want to figure out is like who the legislators are in the town or village or like district that you live in.
Yeah, definitely. So in that case, the primary target would be the person who is able to make the decision to implement your goal. So like who makes decisions and how are they all connected together? So the primary target here, as Marisol mentioned, would be like a city council person, right? They would be able to pass a motion to get that regulation going. Can anyone think of any other primary targets?
I would like to hear Patara Cho's opinion, especially given she's from UCLA School of Architecture and Design. Who do you think are the key stakeholders that are going to make the decision of installation of more gender neutral bathrooms?
Definitely one of the city council person, but I think the education for the idea of gender neutral bathroom is also important. Because I remember that Ishina talked about this before, that I remember Eileen says that a lot of people, like not LGBTQ group, that a lot of people that they're like kind of not willing to use gender neutral bathroom because they feel it's weird to share the bathroom with female or male, like to mix the gender in the bathroom.
So you're saying like general education about like what gender neutral bathrooms are and like why.
Yeah.
Awareness. Yeah, definitely. That's an important goal also. And yeah, we can get more into that with strategies. So yeah, for now, city council person, that's a good primary target. So then when you think about primary targets, you want to think about who influences them. So who do you think could have more pull than yourself on a city council person potentially?
I think I saw someone said university president. Yeah, the presidents of like all kind of university that have power to, I think, influence city council person.
Definitely.
And that also relate to like educational goal that with the gender bathroom as well.
Can I add something?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I remember when I was at UCSB, so I think when I was second year, we the president, they have like guideline for gender I think identity inclusive or like gender inclusive facilities, and they added more gender neutral bathroom in our library. Like they must have at least one gender neutral bathroom every floor of the library. So I think they especially like the university, they are responsible for like these kind of education, and they actually doing it, like take actions. So
yeah, that's interesting. So in that case, the university president directly was able to make this change in the university.
yeah.
So then like they could be primary targets as well.
I might be really ignorant about this. So the designers have no control of like how they lay out the bathrooms, only like the city council person does, and then they pass legislation that is going to influence the design. Is that correct? Otherwise, the design or the architects themselves cannot really play any role in the design or designing into the buildings, the gender neutral bathrooms.
In some ways, it kind of I don't know if cyclical is the best word to describe here, but yeah. So there's basically a minimum. Maybe to take it out of the context of like gender, just to kind of make it a little bit more simplified. If you think about something like earthquakes, there's a minimum code that we have for construction where you have to build to a certain level for earthquake safety. You could build stronger than that. Given the choice, most people in the States, especially where we're prioritizing profits over everything else, are not going to choose to build safer. They're not going to choose to build out past what's required by the minimum standards of code. So if you think about that, frequently you're going to have a similar variation when it comes to bathrooms, where it's either it doesn't occur to people, they don't care, it's not like they don't see it as profitable. There's a whole bunch of different reasons that it could happen, but there's no minimum requirement. And while it might happen, that often means that it doesn't. And like the architect could theoretically do something, but the architect they're being paid to produce a specific kind of product. And frequently some of the considerations that go into the creation of that product are how much money is it going to cost to build it, right? How much money can we make out of this? And so in those areas too, then people aren't going to be more inclusive generally for, again, similar reasons. Either they're not thinking of it, they don't care, they don't want to, they don't think it is profitable, it's more expensive, things like that.
So the architects usually get contracted to design in the certain number of bathrooms, right? They do not have like any flexibility in determining how many bathrooms or what style of bathrooms they design. Is that correct? Or like their decision making, so it's like a predetermined thing that they have to design in?
Well, actually in architectural design, that the regulations in the bathroom is that you have to calculate like the whole building or the whole space, like the capacity, how many people are going to use this space, and there have like a certain percentage. You have to have certain percentage of the bathroom inside of that space. And because the regulation that usually goes with like the formation of the calculation that goes with like how many male bathrooms you should have, how many female bathrooms you should have. So that's what I mentioned about the regulations, because right now we don't have any regulations about gender neutral bathroom. That's why a lot of architects, they can try to design a gender neutral bathroom, because that will like mess up all of the calculations. And that could relate to that the permit of the building will not be approved.
Or I think Marisol also mentioned like who are funding these programs, like or the check writers, basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to bring up as another important secondary target is if you look at different groups, so there's different groups that fund city council people's elections that can be really powerful. So they want to stay on these people's good side. So for example, there's like an association in LA of business owners, like in North LA called VICA. VICA has like a bunch of really wealthy business owners in their membership, and they give a lot of money to city council people elections. So everybody wants to be on their good side. So if you were to go to VICA and make a case for gender neutral bathrooms to them, they could definitely put pressure on some of the city council people. So yeah, funding groups, definitely an important secondary target. Yeah, and also at the end of the day, city council members go up for election. So groups, any sort of like groups of voters, so like voting blocks also could put pressure on them. So yeah, when you think about these secondary targets, the next step is to think about like how do you get to them? So for example, like the city council person would be like in the middle of this circle, and then secondary targets would be the second circle out. And then how do you link to that second circle? So like just looking at that web of connections to help you get to that secondary target to then put pressure. Okay, so the third step is to choose your strategy. In this case, this would follow from some of the medium and short-term goals that we already laid out. So how will you get your target to help you fix the issue identified in particular? So if we go back to our short-term goal, so we're looking at some kind of resolution that mandates a certain percentage of accessible gender-neutral bathrooms in a building. How would we get a city council person to actually do that? They would have to pass a resolution. You can also have a strategy. Somebody was talking about like education around this. So sorry, it'd be like a public campaign, maybe around what gender neutral bathrooms are. So things like that. Can anyone think of another strategy?
So how does the secondary group, so we talked about how we can use their potential like sponsors to influence their decision making. Like how does that belong to choosing your strategy or the next decision? Like how do we so how do we first get in touch with that person, like from a practical level? How do
like
we
how do you get in touch with
how do we get in touch with a city council person?
I think that's where it like really helps to sort of build that web. So like you're looking at your primary targets, and then you're looking at your secondary targets, and then you look within your own group to see who has a connection to any of those secondary targets. So like going back to the strengths that you mentioned, there's a lot of skill sets, there's a lot of experience in the queer community. Chances are somebody is connected to one of these groups or connected to one of these voting blocks, or know somebody who is connected to them. So that's, I think, where that building that web is important. But there's also other ways to get the attention of the primary target that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go through the web, but it's really helpful, I think.
So when we talk about choosing our strategy, this is already assuming that we have like a conversation with the city council person, and then we're like discussing, or
so this is like the strategy is sort of like the specific what you want to do, like how are you going to get them to target it, how are you going to get your target to implement the goal that you thought of. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've already talked to them, but it's sort of like going back and like just trying to frame what you're trying to get done. Does that make sense? So yeah, I think it'll make a little more sense when we break down the strategy into tactics. So if we look at this first strategy, so building a case for a city resolution to be passed. How do we do that? So that's sort of where we just break it down into specific steps. So one thing could be gathering research to support the importance of the issue. So like knowledge production and bringing that to the city council during a council meeting. Does anyone have any other things that come to mind?
Yeah, call or just email them. Like also, I think I tend to prefer emailing because I don't actually really want to talk to people that much. But for those of you that aren't bothered by it, the power of filling up somebody's inbox and also making their interns not really able to do anything else because they're answering your calls is not to be underestimated.
Yeah, definitely. When I was a staffer, I think the most powerful advocates were the ones who got a group together and just like went in, like what Maricel was saying, like emails is a great way to get attention. If you have like a bunch of people but they don't have a lot of time, you can get them to just have like an email template and just get them all to send emails to the city council person. Showing up in person is also super effective. You have like less people, but they may have more time. So I remember there's someone trying to get a bill passed about, I think it was something about disability access, and they were literally in the office every single day, asking like, hey, did the bill get assigned to the committee? Like, where's the bill? Like, just every single day, just there. And you can't ignore that. Like, you literally can't do your job because they're sitting, like, you go to get your coffee and they're like there, like, hey. And yeah, you could do that. Like, you can show up to city council members' offices. Their offices are open. And yeah, if there are certain people in your group and your coalition that have time to do that, like, that's super effective as well. So I think considering the amount of time people have, and just kind of going from that. And another thing here that I mentioned that I think is really important is to contact advocacy organizations that may have already formed around this issue. So for example, if we were to do this like tomorrow in LA, we could do like a quick search of like what groups are already out there trying to do this, and that'll connect us to like a huge group of people that we could use to write the emails, to show up, to unite around this specific issue. And they may already be doing some of this, so we wouldn't be like duplicating efforts too. and they might know some of these secondary targets personally. That would help as well.
How do you find out like what are other people doing? Let's say if there's already a group working on similar things.
That's a good question. A lot of times groups will have like websites. So I think just like Googling. Also, if you go to like the minutes of like a city council meeting and you'll see who like advocates for certain things, like who it'll be all like on the record. So you'll see like, oh, that group advocates for this this resolution that's similar, or even that person. So you can go to that public record and get that from there and contact them as well. Yeah, and or I also just like asking around. I feel like people are just really connected when you start talking and thinking about like who you know, and it just like it's like this whole web. Can anyone think of any other tactics that we haven't talked about? Yeah, so that's pretty much it. That's how you the one way to break it down, and just put it all together. Start with the long-term goal that can kind of like provide some structure for what you want to do, and provide some direction and purpose, and then just breaking it down into something that's we started with this globally getting rid of the concept of non-gender neutral bathrooms, like this really big shift, and then sort of we broke it down into something that is actionable, and we can have a plan. Like, yeah, we could like do this, we could start doing this like tomorrow if we wanted to. So yeah,
so the question is, why aren't people doing this already? What's stopping them? Like, this should have been done a while. And also, how are those trans identities, those type of bill get passed? Like, how can we let them? What are people doing is my question.
That's a good question. I think
fatigue of life. I'm seeing Marisol typed in the chat window. Fatigue of life.
Yeah.
It's just funny.
Yeah, the barriers definitely. I think time is a big one. I think people are so caught up in just like survival that it's hard to have the time to do any of this. And I think that's why like the system is so hard to make change in. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also my question, right? Apart from what you asked, I wonder who's the entity is gonna carry out all these steps, right? The tactics. Like, are we should we expect it's just the volunteering community members, or will there be other entities or that are full-time, like doing this work as a full-time job where they are actually getting paid? Because it's also a question about how much effort and how much time it actually takes, like how many people to carry out all this plan, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's good to get a lay of the land and see like if there are organizations that are already doing some of this work, because then they'll have some funding from donations to be doing this. So they'll, that's something there. And I think also just connecting with people who may have money but not time to do this, but they have the money and they have the passion to do this, and then just like having them fund this, fund the time of people who wouldn't necessarily have the resources to be able to do this otherwise, which, yeah, it's tricky because certain communities will have more resources than others naturally. So I think that's why you see a lot of bad stuff getting passed, because I think some of those communities, they have more resources, and it's like, it's hard.
That's such a good point. We should do collective action. That's exactly why we should all unite using our skill set to collectively, if not push for any good changes, at least stop bad changes from happening. Like we are a pretty powerful community, the entire queer community, right? Like if we stand in solidarity, we can stop a lot of shit from happening, basically. And yeah, I think we can, like, just from United Proud Women or any queer identity based NGOs, we can do a lot of things and gather a lot of people to exert this type of pressure on local communities, on the legislators, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
Yeah.
fundraising, right? It's like a very important. So like kind of finding resources, like so I wonder, are there any like example of like any like a movement that's actually being carried out or goals being achieved by groups or community that's not with so much money or full-time like working groups, but you know, some
Tara has some really good experience. Her union just recently got formed, so Tara is very experienced in this field. Tara, why don't you give us a rundown? How did you make this entire thing from happening?
Yeah, unions. Marcel was also talking about unions. I feel like that's a super good example of like not having a lot of resources, but recognizing that like you yourself are a resource, like your labor is a resource, and there's power in you know, potentially withholding that because they rely on you to build their wealth. So yeah, I think that's a good example. And yeah, we started like our union, it really was just like a conversation where we all realized like we're all getting screwed and we're all like just not in a good situation. And then yeah, we just started looking into it and realized that we could become part of a larger union, that everybody else who's a member pays dues. So collectively we have like a lot of like legal backing, we have like strike pay. And it's because everybody who's part of this union is paying a very small percentage of their paycheck into the larger union. So
in the timeline perspective, how long did it take to first for you to form the idea? Like for each of the step that you mentioned, how long did it take for you, for example, to come up with ideas, define goals, and all the way to make this into a reality?
We started talking about it together as a group, I think like maybe a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. And then we kind of like laid out like the steps and like what we needed to do. We talked to people we knew who were like in unions or like were worked for unions, and then we chose one that what seemed like the right fit for us, and then we sort of got the ball rolling on like filing. I think that was like
when you said we, how many people did you work with at the beginning? I assume it's still quite hard to find like the core group of people who really care, right?
Yeah. At the beginning it was just 3 of us. And then we started talking to more people. It became like 30. And that was sort of the core group that like you know, started convincing everybody, like getting everybody on the same page. And then so when our employer like contested our right to unionize and then we had to have an election, then we were able to win the election because we spent a lot of time, you know, talking to people and just like trying to get people on the same page. So yeah. Yeah, it took a long time. But it's because our employer was like putting all these roadblocks, like trying to really intimidate us. And
so how when you got in contact with the union, how did you negotiate the terms for your group to join, and how did you negotiate with the school? What were some tactics that you used?
So I think the union sort of has its own like set terms, and that's just like that's across the board for every group that's part of them. We for the one that we're a part of, at least, like the union dues don't we don't start paying until we already have a successful contract in place. So by then the idea is like our payroll increase. And yeah, so it was just like we looked at different unions and they seemed to be the most relevant and had the best terms. We haven't started negotiating with brand yet with the company. We're in the middle of electing our reps right now. So the election starts next week. So yeah.
Nice. So just from the idea of the union to the formation of the union took a year and a half of effort. Wow.
Yeah.
What were some most time consuming part? Was it talking to other people, or?
Yeah, I think it was talking to people, making sure people felt comfortable and like in the loop. It's like a lot of people, like, they don't really have the time to be directly involved, but they still want to know what's happening. So like we would have to have like newsletters, town halls, all these things, and sort of like make sure we looked like professional and legit and like people could trust what was happening and they would get like weirded out. So yeah, I think just talking to people, making sure people knew this was like a good thing for them, that took a long time.
Yeah, that sounds like community work that we are facing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question there. So what kind of communication infra do you actually use or set up for like keeping people in the loop, or having this kind of serious and regular checkups or town hall? Just curious.
Yeah, so we did different levels of communication, like based on how involved people wanted to be. So we had like a WhatsApp group for people who want to like know like, you know, more details on like every step of like what's happening. And there's like a Slack for people who want to be like super involved in the decisions. And then we did use like weekly newsletters for people who are just like kind of more passively, they just want to like read, you know, one email a week to know what's going on. And then for people who like didn't even check their emails, we had like a lot of town halls, so they could just like drop in. We had like office hours, so a few of us said like, hey, you know, from 2 to 4 on a Tuesday, like come by. We also had like happy hours, like, you know, every Thursday we'd all just like get a beer down the street, and like people could show up and get a beer and ask questions too. So like we had a lot of different ways for people to show up and ask questions, like even if they didn't have a lot of time, or yeah, we tried to make it like super accessible.
Sounds really good. Yeah. So you have many things set up. Let's say, so for the newsletter, say, did you just send out email, or do you actually build a website or some blogs you keep, you know?
Yeah, we made a website to have, and then we saved every week's newsletters on the website so people could access it that way. But we also sent it in an email. Oh, it's a cute cat.
Yes. Oh. And also, like, do you have any kind of like registration, that kind of process or infra, you know, kind of to bookkeeping, like who are the committee members? Like I wonder if you need to send out a newsletter through email. Do you just email group, mail list, something like that, or?
Yeah. Yeah, so we were using people's work emails, which as of now at least is like still legal. So
And
yeah,
also
we just
like some like maintenance or developing kind of R&D cost for building the website or doing the publishing.
Yeah. So we just the initial website, like we just built it ourselves, just like volunteers. But then once you know, we got more involved with UAW, they offered to pay for the domain. So at first it was just like a free like Wix site. So
oh, you actually got some funding to cover that, I see.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's one example of
how did you get the funding?
from UAW.
Oh, I see. So they invest a little bit in your chapter formation before you become
Yeah, so like they had like lawyers representing us in the hearing. They have people, I don't know if you've met, I wanted to introduce Molly to you at some point. She's like the UAW organizer who's been helping us. So she like dedicated like a lot of her time to make sure like we were all okay. And
she's also a queer identified woman, right? That's amazing. I just love it how we are all making social changes, being queer and being advocates. It's awesome.
That sounds really good, right? UAW has a support for your union. Wonder if Up Women can actually also utilize that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, let's reach out to Human Rights Campaign or like big big NGOs for like our small initiatives and see how much they can help. Yeah, at least they can build some network with us or like connect us with the other groups who share similar visions.
Yeah, that'd be super cool.
Yeah, and LA LGBTQ Center and maybe Challenge in Seattle, so can also find something in Seattle. Yeah, this type of coalition forming is super helpful. I see Yujue 老师 saying something in chat. Do you want to like maybe tie this back to the Chinese situation on how activists in China do certain types of advocacies?
I mean, because of the socio-political climate in China, actually the LGBT activists, they can only, advocate for their rights indirectly and in alliance with like the disabled people, like the single women who pursue for the motherhood, because there is the very rigid restriction against the LGBT agenda and LGBT rights advocacy. If you want to, pursue the equal rights for the LGBT citizens, you cannot acknowledge the general rights advocacy and publicly with the term LGBT. You need to like, if you want to have the gender neutral bathrooms, you cannot call, okay, we need more gender neutral bathrooms because there are transgender people, because in China there is no legal protection for LGBT people, so you need to form alliance with the disabled activists, because there are legal protection for the disabled people and for the barrier-free environment. So you need to use the existing law and use their power to call for the accessible bathrooms, which can be also used for transgender people, because those bathrooms are always gender neutral. And in China, if you are facing the discrimination based on your gender, based on your sexuality in workplace, you cannot pursue your rights for the environment just in alliance with the labor unions, because actually in China, the grassroots labor unions, which they fight for the labor rights, are usually target as labeled as like the threat to the social solidarity by the Chinese government. Instead, you need to pursue your rights case by case. And when you have if you win the lawsuit against the company that discriminate you, you can share this kind of successful experience with other LGBT people. And I know there are LGBT communities. They provide this kind of legal assistance for the for queer people who facing the discrimination in workplace and in school. But we cannot call for like the employment equality, like the discrimination against LGBT people, and for the law making. This is kind of kind of a tacit strategy in China, but I know it's way to negotiate with this situation, but it's really hard if you want to survive, you want to struggle for your own rights.
I think this is such a powerful message. It's like under every situation, there's almost always some way to form a coalition with other groups, and within the certain set of constraints, still fight for our own rights, or just navigate the system a little bit differently, but there are still ways to make things happen. So I guess the message here, at least for my personal takeaway, is to not give up hope, even in like a highly censored environment. There is still something people can do to empower themselves, or to empower the communities in general. Yeah, Tara, we should really connect with Molly and see how she moved the entire unionization effort for not only Rand but for like other places, and then like learn from this type of potential coalition forming, because this also involves working with people with from different social economic class, with different culture backgrounds or races. It involves it will probably face some internal conflicts within communities, and I'm wondering how they like handle this, how they work together. And yeah, sounds like really interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot of different groups. And I think one thing I'm interested in that I don't know if it's happening is like international coalitions of unions, like different countries. Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think could be super powerful.
Like the continuity of queer Marxism. Okay, I think that's the end of today's discussion. Tara, do you have any final notes to tell the audience?
Yeah, thank you for having me and letting me go through this. Everyone's comments and everything's like always super interesting. Last time too, it's just like, yeah, I feel so happy leaving these and
Yes, this video recording will be edited and put online so more people can study the strategics, the strategies and the tactics of form a coalition to do advocacy. Thanks a lot, Tara, for coming to our forum, and hope we can see you more often in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
All right, thank you everyone for attending. I'll see you next week. Next week is going to be a big session as well for Professor Shuzhen Huang, and please come and join the discussion and welcome the professor who is willing to spend time talking to us about our own identities. Thank you everyone. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.